So I'm going to read through War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. This is in preparation for your Edexcel IGCSE English Literature exam, Paper 1, Section A. Looking at the title, I think Duffy simply called it War Photographer because she wanted to highlight who is the focus in this poem. It will cover topics of war, but I actually think the focus isn't necessarily on what happens in these other countries, but more so on the war photographer and how having this type of job affects them. In his dark room he is finally alone, with spools of suffering set out in ordered rows. The only light is red and softly glows, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. So initially, I think there's a sinister tone created through diction and through sibilance. So first of all, he's in a dark room. Obviously, this is a dark room where he can process his photos, and that's why there's a red light. But you could argue that dark and red have connotations of evil, which help create that sinister tone, as well as the use of sibilance. I haven't actually written sibilance down, so please do that when you're annotating your poem. But it creates that kind of that sound, that spools of suffering set, just helps create that sinister tone along with the diction. It's interesting that he places these photos in ordered rows. So we have this imagery potentially of war graves and how order is given to soldiers' graves, which is quite ironic considering the chaotic nature of war. So this imagery really kind of juxtaposes with what the photographer will have been exposed to. And I wonder if that's frustrating as well for a photographer, trying to bring order to chaos, which I'm sure is really impossible. And we also have religious references where his work is almost likened to a priest preparing for mass. I think this is because he sees his work as sacred. He obviously gives great importance to what he does. He thinks it's worthwhile and it's extremely important to take these images and bring them back to people in the Western world. And so the religious references, I believe, is to highlight how important the war photographer believes his job is. And that's followed by the last line, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh. So the use of plosives there could represent the harshness of war, but could also mimic the sound of gunshots or the quick fire pace, the that sound as well. So you can imagine him developing these photos and almost reliving those sounds that he experienced in these type of places. And then it ends with this Bible reference, all flesh is grass, which basically means life is transitory. It's a reminder that we all die. I wonder if that plays on a photographer's mind when they are exposed to death, much more so than the average person. I wonder if that's something, as they're developing their photos again, that comes to mind of how quickly life can end, especially in these type of places where they are places of war. So we have first of all we end with this feeling of life isn't forever. And then I think the photographer starts the next stanza with he has a job to do. This short sentence almost to bring him back on track. So it's quite emotionless, and maybe that's the way a war photographer handles the difficulties of their job. Solutions slop in trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So that's quite interesting. The use of tremble there indicates he is emotionally affected as he's developing his photos. He starts to tremble, so he clearly has been exposed to something quite horrifying. Rural England. It's interesting here that we've got the caesura, which you could argue represents the separation. So maybe the separation he feels, suddenly he's back in rural England. He feels like he is a world away from where he's been. But also that might highlight how he views people in England as well, that they are so separated from this other part of the world where life is very, very different. And that's supported with the following lines: home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel, to fields which don't explode beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So first of all, we've got home again. We'll come back to this right at the end of this video, but this already hints of how repetitive his job is. It's quite a cyclical nature. So you can imagine he's always going off and coming back and having to do the same thing. But we have the simplicity of life in rural England represented by ordinary and simple, something that weather can make everything better. But in contrast to that, he's come from a world where explosions take place beneath the feet of running children in a nightmare heat. So we've got emotive language there with the use of children, which really pulls at the heartstrings of the reader and just emphasises the horrors that he must have seen while being abroad. Something is happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. So we've got one main thing here that I took from this stanza is this feeling of otherness. We've got stranger's features and a reminder of how separate this feels by highlighting the fact that this blood is stained into foreign dust. Duffy could have just said into dust, but I think she's trying to highlight how separate the war photographer must feel at times, and must feel, again, a world apart even when they're there. And we've got this imagery of death as well, this half-formed ghost, which could be the war photographer watching the film in front of him or the photos in front of him develop, but also could be as well the reminder that he's looking at a photo of a dead person, and therefore he is a ghost in some ways. And again, talking about otherness, he sought approval without words. So there's that element of separation again, because he cannot communicate with the same language as the wife of the dead man, and so he has to communicate in some other way. So again, there's just this element of him being separated from this. And the final stanza, 100 agonies in black and white, from which his editor will pick out 5 or 6 from Sunday's supplement. Such a contrast. He's got 100 photos of these horrifying images, and the editor's going to come around and just choose 5 or 6. So that contrast with the numbers in itself highlight how emotionless this process seems to be. The simple language as well of just this editor turning up. Look at the verbal phrase as well, pick out. They're not pondering over those images, they're not asking questions, they're just looking for something to fill a space in a Sunday supplement. But there's stories behind every single photo, so that's got to be a really difficult process for the war photographer. He would have seen all of this in person, and just to see an editor walk in and pick out 5 or 6 must be really disheartening. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So obviously this is emphasising the fact that yes, the Western reader is going to get upset but not for very long. And the midline rhyme highlights the speed of how long it takes for them to forget. So by the time they finish their bath and then they're having their lunch beers, they're over it. And then I think many readers can reflect on this and see that they've done the same. I know I've done this, where I've got upset by something I've read or something I've seen on the news, and then in the next minute I'm wondering about what I'm going to eat for dinner or whatnot. So I think this must be really frustrating for a photographer who's seen all of this in person, to know that really these photographs will only create a few tears for a short amount of time before people move on. From the aeroplane, he stares impassively at where he earns his living, and they do not care. So it's interesting that he starts staring impassively as well. There seems to be a defeated tone there, especially as the poem ends on they do not care. So his efforts are futile. The whole point of his job is to bring to light what happens in other parts of the world, to encourage people to care about it. And that hasn't happened. People may shed a tear or two, and then they get on with their lives, probably because they've been exposed to so many images like that now. But I think it's futile as well, because he doesn't care anymore. He stares impassively at where he earns his living. He's become desensitized as well. So there's an element of defeat there as well, because he doesn't care. So looking at the form and structure, we have 4 stanzas of 6 lines and a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, C, D, D. So what we do have is a really tightly controlled structure. And you can think about why Duffy chose that. I would argue it's to represent the control that the war photographer attempts to have on the situation. Think about how he puts his photographs in those ordered rows as well, and how governments create these graves for soldiers, and they're all ordered as well. But in reality, war is not ordered in any sense. So that's what I think, but it'll be interesting to hear what you think as well. Also, it's a cyclical structure, which links to what I said in the second stanza about him saying home again. So we know this is something that he continually does. So at the beginning, he's in his dark room. By the end, he's off on another trip. So we know he's eventually going to come back from that trip and end up in his dark room again. And then I think there's the cyclical nature or structure of the poem emphasises again how futile his efforts are, because he's just going around in circles and nothing's really changing. A supplement gets filled every Sunday and a tear might be shed, but people get on with their lives. So this just seems to be, there's something, there's a sense of hopelessness with this poem, I think, and I think that's linked with the cyclical structure, that it's just never ending. There's always going to be a war. The photographer's always going to come home, always provide those photos. Nothing's really going to change.